Bismillah, how are you?
Yes. Bismillah al-Hayy al-Azal. Wade, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you? What's happening?
Thank you. I'm fine. I just want to put something very quickly, really quickly in the question, right? And I'd like to be talking about moral dualism. You know, fundamentalist Baha'is put special emphasis on, moral, mechanisms, embedded in the Baha'i, pillars of the faith. Baha'i fundamentalists, see the world as, comprised of a small cadre of those quote unquote firm in the covenant. They, then admit a larger number of Baha'is, okay, who are quote unquote infirm, but perhaps not. They worry about smaller number of dissident Baha'is, okay, who attempt to undermine the covenant. In response to liberal, discussions on, different and, diverse platforms, I believe I found an Iranian American member of the NSA of Alaska wrote, quote, "I do believe that the covenant is being undermined and challenged continuously by a subgroup within Talisman. The self-appointed loyal opposition and dissident group is determined to force the Universal House of Justice to reform itself and to be morally consistent with their private agendas and interpretations. I am vehemently opposed to this. Should I remain silent? You tell me." Okay, Wahid, my question goes to this very conception. There are the covenant breakers, according to Baha'i sources, mainly schism, schismatic groups, are rather small, who are considered spiritually deceased, and who must be shunned away completely.
Whatever.
Okay. They feel it is unwise even to read something they have written, lest one become infected. And, for instance, for fundamentalists, there is, a vast sea of misguided and, benighted non-Baha'i stuff vis-a-vis, what they call faith. What does it come from? Is it the scriptural principle of the Baha'i faith that all religions are one? And then, many Baha'is, should and actually have to turn a blind eye on that? What's all about that? I cannot get it.
These people, this entire ideology swims in oceans of cognitive dissonance, okay? All this talk about the religions are one, this is all talking points and gimmickry. It has no reality with these people at all, beginning with their founder. I mean, if you go and read the Kitab al-Badi of Baha'u'llah, his refutation of his detractors amongst the Bayanis, the entire book is one endless gaslighting of the Bayan from start to finish, and especially of Subh Azal and his supporters. So, right there and then, in terms of the questions of the oneness of religions, Baha'u'llah himself failed that test at the very beginning of his claim, right? Let alone the people that we're talking about today. The fact of the matter is, although the concept of a covenant exists in Islam, it exists in Judaism. In Islam, it's the mithaq, and in the Shiite dealing with this subject, it's a very overriding concept, wherein the Imams of the Ahl Bayt, peace be upon them, are the embodiment of the covenant of Muhammad, and therefore the covenant of God. But even still, with Shia Muslims, even though there has always been, rancor amongst the Shia and Sunni, nevertheless, the manner in which even the Shia have dealt with questions of the covenant of Islam doesn't reach the kind of psychotic view that the Baha'is have of the concept of the covenant. The only difference between Muslims and Baha'is is that the Baha'is, thankfully, still don't have political power in their hand. Whereas if they did, I am certain that they would be far worse in the implementation of these dystopian ideas of theirs than the early Muslims ever were. Najasa, for example, or uncleanliness, impurity, is a concept that is attached to notions of being on one side or the other of the covenant, right? In the Baha'i writings, a covenant breaker, because the ahd is someone who is defined not only as breaking some form of a contractual agreement between them and the manifestation during that dispensation, but they are also heretofore automatically making themselves impure by virtue of their view towards the covenant. Now, that is the legal principle behind this. Nevertheless, as I have said many, 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 many times, the very concept, the very legality, the very legitimacy of the Baha'i covenant is seriously under question given the historical events that we know about. Namely, that Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah can in no wise, shape, or form be considered the promised one of the Bayan, for all of the reasons that we've spelled out in previous podcasts and what I've written about online and elsewhere. So therefore, from a legal standpoint, that covenant is illegitimate. And if there was ever a court to actually try a case around this, I cannot see how they can see it any other way. Nevertheless, the implementation of this notion of covenant breaking has very overtly, on multiple occasions, transgressed laws and customs that are prevalent in the secular world today. The manner in which the Baha'is either treat or even view other covenant breakers in some fashion can be construed as a human rights violation, because they are othering these people who are merely ideological, they're on the other ideological spectrum to where they are. They do not believe in the legitimacy of the current Universal House of Justice, or previously of Shoghi Effendi, or before that of Abdul Baha, and so on. Nevertheless, when, for example, even though the Baha'is speak through two sides of their mouth about this, the manner in which the Baha'is treat covenant breakers by, for example, shunning them, ostracizing them. Like, for example, if there's someone lurking or discussing in social media and they immediately block these people, etc., and encourage others to do so, these are forms of human rights violations. And in certain jurisdictions, they are civil rights violations. And although untested, eventually these issues can indeed be taken to the courts of law and tried. But the Baha'i fundamentalist mentality is such that it doesn't see things from this perspective, and it justifies itself and its own behavior, even within the context of a secular society, in such fashion that it allows itself to behave in such fashion against people that it deems to be covenant breakers. This is one of the big problems with this thing, but it also simultaneously reveals, number one, in the manner in which the issue of covenant breaking is actively implemented as policy by the Baha'i organization. It reveals that organizationally...
Since when exactly?
Hold on, let me finish the sentence. It reveals that the manner in which this thing operates is as a cult. It is authoritarian, right? So therefore, it in a sense, it is monopolizing the space of even its own adherents and dictating to them who they may or may not associate with, right? And this is precisely the definition of what a cult is, and also instances a politically authoritarian organization. Go ahead.
Okay. Last question.
Sure.
The other day, I bumped into a quasi-Baha'i friend, who once met Peter Khan, a Pakistani Australian, engineer who was elected to the Universal House of Justice in 1987. Okay. Mm-hmm. And according to this, quasi Baha'i friend, Peter Khan, out of the blue, decided to open up to him. World-denying fundamentalists, go to the extreme of discouraging young Baha'is from seeking a college education because Peter Khan believed that the revelation of Baha'u'llah contains all knowledge. The physical science, according to Peter Khan, are stigmatized as being incorrect because they take no account of the spiritual dimension of Baha'u'llah teachings.
But
psychology is condemned.
How does
is it true?
But well, it may be true. Peter Khan was a glaze-eyed cultist, but the man was an engineer with a PhD who also used to teach here in Brisbane at the University of Queensland. So how does he square that circle? How do you apply principles of engineering using the writings of Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah to a problem? I mean, one can have a theological position, right, about a certain problem, but not conflate that theological position with the nitty-gritty of scientific method, right? This is the problem with the Baha'is, because they, on the one hand, they claim, that science and religion are in harmony, but then in their statements and their pronouncements, they conflate theology with other things, right? That should.
Of course, Bahid, you know that. I'm sure you are totally in agreement with me that Baha'i fundamentalists are sometimes themselves engineers or doctors, scientists, and do not altogether reject the scientific worldview. But they often feel it is wrong, for an adherent to speak of scripture or history of, the Baha'i faith in academic term,
Well, just one of the ways that I have unpacked this is that I look at it from the perspective that a lot of these people are posturing, okay? So it isn't the case that deep down they actually believe in this nonsense. Is that in the Baha'i community, there is a lot of LARPing. Everybody is trying to demonstrate to everybody else how loyal they are, right? And there's various psychological reasons for this. One of which, I came to the conclusion to is that most Baha'is, right, who act this way, deep down really don't believe in it. But because they are surviving in a community that requires and demands loyalty of that level, these people try to outdo each other in ridiculous pronouncements of their loyalty to this organization and its leadership. So this is why all of this is going on, because no scientist, no one who knows anything about scientific method, the basics, can possibly turn around and say nonsense like that. I mean, if Peter Khan had made such a pronouncement while he was the dean of the engineering department at the University of Queensland, they would have fired him. The university would have thrown him out on its tail. But
that's right.
But once he got into the position that he get first as Continental Counselor and then later as a member of the USJ, is then when he felt comfortable in making these ridiculous statements such as it is. Look, we can have disagreements about the application of scientific method. We can also say that the scientific method has certain limitations, whether from a philosophical point of view or even from an empirical point of view. But the fact is that the scientific method itself is a methodology that works, right, albeit in a limited scope. Nevertheless, to then conflate theological diktat with the scientific method is fundamentalism, and it's precisely the kind of worldview, dangerous worldview, that has led to all kinds of weird, wacky, and tragic things, especially with Christian fundamentalists and the evangelical movement and what have you. And it's precisely, I would argue, in this day and age, in a country like the United States, why so many evangelical Christians can come out and believe that Donald Trump was the anointed of God, despite all evidence to the contrary, proving this man to be a lecher and a sinner by their own theological definitions. And this is the problem. Once you walk down that slippery slope of the kind that the Peter Hans, etc., are walking, it is very easy to be sucked into every form of deception, false news, fake news, and what have you in perpetuity. And this is a problem that we're finding in the world at the moment, where people are trying to find, rather than being objective in certain things or even allowing their personal beliefs to evolve, right? Rather than doing that, most people, especially in the West, and especially if they're conservatives politically, tend to find, they work on a tautology, right? They have a certain axiomatic belief system, and then they go out searching the world for all things that validate it, right? But this is backwards, and this is against the scientific method. It's against empirical investigation. It's against, any form of knowledge production and progress therein. And the Baha'is unfortunately suffer from all of this. And this is why their scholarship is ridiculous. And with every passing generation, it falls more and more and more and more into the hole of fundamentalism and closed-mindedness and outright fantasy in almost every respect.
But on this very note, it's not all about science, Scriptural, literalists, whether of soft or hard, variety, are often promoted within the ranks of the Baha'i administration. Yes. Especially, to the offices of auxiliary board member and councillors, and even people like Mr. Erfan Sabeti and the like. They use their offices, for the promotion of anti-intellectualism. Tell me about anti-intellectualism.
Let me say something about someone like Erfan Sabeti. Erfan Sabeti is a trained sociologist, albeit not a good one. Nevertheless, anybody who has read Emil Durkheim, anyone who's read Max Weber, anyone who has read Mannheim and all of these great German sociologists of the 20th centuries cannot be a fundamentalist by conviction. So the conclusion is that people like Erfan Sabeti and similar are LARPers. They are pretending because they're surviving in a system. It's like a form of corporate ladder climbing. And this is their bread and butter, so they act in a certain way with this kind of information because they know how to game a community and game a system for their own personal advancement.
So my question is exactly why this field has of late largely, dominated by, anti-intellectualism, literally.
Because anti-intellectualism, unfortunately, is one of the byproducts of Western neoliberal capitalism. It's not just the Baha'is, although the Baha'is have been riding this train for a very long time in the West. Nevertheless, one of the byproducts of this system that we're currently living in is precisely neoliberalism. And this is how, for example, Donald Trump was elected in 2016. This is how the Tea Party got a surge in the United States during the presidency of Obama. This is why even in a country like Australia, where I'm living at the moment, most people are more inclined to sound bites and rhetorics and polemical talking points of the Murdoch news corporations like Sky News, etc., than to actually sit down and think about issues, right? This is a problem that is everywhere. It's not just localized in Baha'ism, it's everywhere. And it is a sign of the times in some respects. Even though with the expansion of technology, with the expansion of information on the internet that allows people to have every form of information at their fingertips, nevertheless, people have become more intellectually lazy. And as a result of intellectual laziness, they have become anti-intellectual.
Wahid, you are an author. I'm an author too, and both of us, have long been declared as the nemesis of this quote-unquote faith, okay? Yeah. You know that. The Universal House of Justice, while gaslighting scholarship, has made increasingly strong, pronouncements against humanist and materialist, academics, in the ranks of the Baha'i. A crisis was provoked by the plan in the 1980s and 1990s of some Baha'is academics to publish a Baha'i encyclopedia, for which, they gained the backing of even the United States NSA, which spent some $800,000 on it. And as the articles commissioned, however, were summed up, under this title of Baha'Ipedia. What happened to Baha'Ipedia, and why they stopped, this Harvard-sponsored project?
Because apparently at one point John Walbridge was the editor-in-chief. Now just remember, this is going back to the 90s. There were several articles that the Universal House of Justice didn't agree with because they were not fundamentalist enough. And so basically, even though the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States had invested in this project, basically the USJ in Haifa shut the whole project down. And so then, most of the authors and their entries ended up, self-publishing their entries either elsewhere or online and what have you. I mean, the decision was so bad that even a Glazite nut cultist like Mujan Momin had a problem with the decision of the USJ at the time.
Because I've heard, another friend, told me when the editor resigned, the encyclopedia was ordered rewritten.
It was ordered rewritten, and I think they even did it to some degree, but they have still yet to actually publish this thing in full, which tells you that even with the rewriting and even while they're trying to placate the USJ and its sensibilities, no matter how these academics push or try, this body in Haifa, Israel, doesn't want to have this kind of information out there, which is just as well, because most of this information that they're putting in there is spun history. It's not real history. It's not critical. Most of their sourcing is flawed. They're silent on a lot of different things and what have you. They don't want to talk about, actual critical historical text. They demonize certain figures. And this could also open them up, at a certain point of time to all kinds of challenges, whether on an academic level or on a legal level. These things are inevitable.
Our mutual friend, Dr. Majid Ziai.
Yes.
He pointed out, very, intelligently to a problem that is arising. He says, note that for a Baha'i, simply to write about the religion using, academic tools is seen as an act of aggression, an attempt to impose methodology.
Yeah.
Is it true?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Azal.
Okay.
And hope we can continue this discussion, another time.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.